Welcome to the Amazing Collection. Today we're looking at the book of Judges, the book of the cycle of sin. You might want to go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Judges. It's the 7th book in the Bible. We're into the historical section now, and today we'll be looking at the Israelites after they've occupied the land. And I wonder how many of you, like me, have ever done anything wrong. Now, that's not the question. That's part A. I know the answer to that. The rest of the question is, and you realized it because of the results, the consequences, and you're really sorry for it, and you said, I'll never do it again, but you did. Have you ever done that? Okay, all the time. That is so very true. We do that, don't we? And that is exactly where we find the Israelites today. One time, my husband and I, early in our marriage, had a little bit of debt. I'm sure nobody's ever been there. And we decided that if we ever got any extra money, we were going to pay that off. And so we did at one point. I think we probably got an income tax refund or something. I'm not sure exactly what. But we went from department store to department store paying off that sum of money. And we were so proud of ourselves. And when we went to the last department store and paid that last bill, it was like, wow, what a great feeling. We are debt-free. Can you imagine? And we go down the escalator, and what do you think we ran smack dab into? The sale of the year. The sale you can't pass up. You just couldn't pass it up. And how do you think we bought those items? We'd already spent all of our money paying off our debt. So we just went back in debt again. Have you ever done anything crazy like that? Well, the Israelites have done that with sin. They are continually finding themselves in a mess. Judges is about a group of people who do what they deem right in their own eyes, regardless of what God has said. And we're going to see a lot of similarities today to us and to Judges. Now, Judges is going to show us that it's a pretty colorful book. And it really shows man at his worst, unfortunately. But it's a book of hope and encouragement as well. Because over and over again, we see what a forgiving, loving God we have. We see that no matter how many times we fall, and how many times we sin, and how many times we walk away from God, that He is so faithful. He always hears the repentive cries of His children. And He always, always listens and forgives. That's what Judges is about. And I want you to not miss that as we look at some of these escapades that are going on today. Now, it's believed that Samuel wrote the book. This is according to the Talmud. And the main characters are going to be different judges. But we're going to look at 3 specifically today. They're the most well-known. And that would be Deborah and Gideon and Samson. Now, it's the book of the cycle of sin. We're going to be talking about that. And the time frame is when the land has been occupied, where the people have come over and have gone into the promised land with Joshua, you remember. And it's between that time and the monarchy, or King Saul, the first king. It takes place between 1380 and 1050 BC, and it covers about 330 years. Now, one thing you're going to want to know is that some of the things that are going on in the book of Judges are simultaneous. In other words, there's not a judge always, and that cycle ends, and then another judge, and that way. It's not exactly chronological. It's sort of mixed up. And so when one thing is happening in one part of the country, there's probably something else going on in another part of the country. Now, it takes place in Canaan. It was once Canaan, now it's Israel. And it shows the results of living a life apart from God. That's what we see. The results of that, the consequences of sin, when we step out on our own and we do what's right in our own eyes, as the Israelites did. Now, we're going to be looking at chapter 1 through 2, first of all, and we're going to see the causes for their failure. And there were causes. There are things that caused this cycle of sin to start. Now, if you'll look in Judges, and you'll see in chapter 1, and we'll begin there, and then on over into chapter 2, at first everything was really, really great. I mean, these people were doing what they should do. Now, we learned that Joshua died. He was a wonderful leader, you remember, Moses' successor, and he died, but the people continued to follow God because his influence spilled over to these elders. And they walked with God because of that. And so they inquired of God, and they had victory after victory after victory, just like when Joshua was alive. But then we find that they stopped inquiring of God. And so we're going to see what was going on here. First of all, the land was almost totally occupied. The heathen had been destroyed, except there were some strongholds. And God had said, rid the land of all of these, but they didn't do that. Instead of getting rid of these people, they decided, well, we'll just get along with them, or we'll make them slaves. Whatever they decided to do, the people weren't gone, and the influence was there, and they were still in the land. And that was disobedience for what God had said. And so we find that when they inquired of God, they had victory. But as the influence of these people came in, the victories were fewer and fewer. And we find the people turning away from God. The bottom line is they're doing it again. They're doing it again. They're blending and they're mixing. And they're looking just like everyone else. Now, the new generation did not know God. And they did not know the work that He had done. They weren't told this and they didn't remember. So Israel began to do evil in God's sight and to worship idols. Idol worship came in as a result of these people in the land. And so they rebelled against God. Look with me, if you will, in chapter 2. Verse 7, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which He had done in Israel. Then Joshua died at the age of 110. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which He had done for Israel. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. So they turned their back on God. And verse 14 tells us that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and that He gave them into the hands of these foreign nations. He allowed these nations to stay in the land, 5 of them exactly. We're told to test Israel. And so God allowed the enemy to come in and to oppress. And that's what began to happen. Israel forgot God because things were going great for them. And then they rebelled against Him. And then God rejected them. And then they repented. Oh, they cried out. And then God heard them and He rescued them. And He rescued them by way of a rescuer who was a judge. And then there was rest. And then they repeated it. That went on and on. There are 7 cycles of sin in the book of Judges. Now, these judges that God raised up were ordinary people. They were ordinary men, and there's a woman involved here who God changed into extraordinary vessels for Himself. We're going to see that. We're going to look at 3 of them. Now, judges were military and political leaders. They were, as I said, ordinary people turned into extraordinary people. Judges in the Hebrew language means ruler, deliverer, savior. They delivered and they liberated. Now, we're going to look at the different cycles of sin with 3 of these judges. So look with me now all the way over to chapter 3. We're going to look chapter 3 through 16. The Israelites rebelled, and then God rejected, and then they repented, then God rescued, and then there was rest, and they repeated it. Remember that. Now, there were 3 judges that stand out, and we know them very well, and that is Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Deborah is a woman, and she is a heroine in a land that needed hope. They were in wartime, and this is incredibly unusual, very, very rare for God to put a woman in this position. In fact, she is the only woman in all of Scripture to hold this type of position. You know, this was a man's world at that time. And it says that she held court under a tree, and all of the sons of Israel came to her for judgment. What an incredible thing to happen. Before Deborah, there had been 3 judges who had come into the land, but after each one died, the cycle repeated. Their influence went away, and the cycle of sin repeated. And now Deborah came on the scene. And when Deborah came on the scene, They had been oppressed for 20 years, and the Israelites were very frightened of them because they were well equipped and they had many, many chariots. And so when Deborah came on the scene, it was a wonderful relief to the people. And God gave her a message one day and told her that there was going to be victory. And she went to Barak, who was one of the generals in the army, and told him what God had said. But Barak sort of backed off and said, like we do sometimes, well, have you thought about this plan? You know how we try to alter what God wants us to do sometimes? So Barak told her that he would go if she would go with him. And so she said, I'll go with you, but you won't get the honor of this victory. It will go to another woman. And so another woman did receive the victory. You'll want to read that story because it's quite interesting. But the thing I want you to see about Deborah is how God delights in using women. So many times today, we listen to the lies that are out there as we're put down for being women, or we're told that we need to compete in a man's world, and yet God has made women so different and for such a different purpose. If we could just grasp that truth and hang on to it, because women are uniquely made to be uniquely used by God, and He does use us in very unique ways. I want us to understand that, and I want you to think about this. Are you a woman of God? There are battles raging, ladies, that only we can fight. The battles are in our homes, and the battlefront is in our neighborhoods, and the battles are in the schools and in the nation, and we have a place. God has a place for us if we do it the right way. He never said for us to do it as men, but to do it as women. But He's not looking necessarily for your ability, because goodness knows, if He was looking for all of us to have great ability right then and there on our own, we'd think we wouldn't need Him. He's looking for our availability. He makes us able. He equips us to do whatever it is He's called us to do. Now, there are opportunities for us. How available are you to do them? Are you willing to step out and do what He's asked you to do? It might be a difficult thing. Under Deborah, now, there was peace in the land. Think about this, ladies. 40 years, she brought peace to the land. You talk about influence. That lady had influence. And she was a busy lady. She was a wife, and she was a judge, and she was a prophetess. And that means that she was an inspired speaker, and that she was a declarer and an announcer. Now, we women can do that pretty well, can't we? We're pretty good at declaring and announcing, aren't we? We need to quit saying, I'm just a woman. I'm just a wife. I'm just a mother. I'm just a whatever. We are daughters of the King. And I mean, He's got work for us to do, and we need to be doing it, don't we? And sometimes we're just sitting back saying, I have no influence at all. Well, you do. While we're raising the next generation. And we have a very important job to do. So don't you forget that. And Judges, I think, shows us that with Deborah. Now, our next judge we find in chapter 6, and that's Gideon. Now, you probably know a little bit about Gideon. Probably what you know about him is the fleece. That's probably the thing that you really remember about Gideon. But there was, remember, the 40 years of rest with Deborah. And now, when Gideon comes on the scene, the cycle has repeated itself again. And Gideon has been oppressed with all of the Israelites along with them for 7 years. And this time is the Midianites. Now, these were a gang of folks. They were like bandits in the hills. It was sort of like how we hear about guerrilla warfare today. They would swoop down and take everything the Israelites had. And a lot of times they would wait until they brought in their crop. And as soon as that crop appeared, before it could be harvested, these Midianites would come out of the hills and take it all. And they'd take not only the crops, but also the flocks. And so they were living in caves. They were living in caves like animals. They were scared to death. And the day that Gideon comes on the scene, he's hiding out. He's in the wine press thrashing wheat. Because he knew if he thrashed it in the open, like you generally would do, that the Midianites would see him, and here they'd come. And they'd get it all. So he's hiding there doing that, trying to scrape a little food together, when the angel of the Lord appears. When you see that term, the angel of the Lord, not an angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord, that is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. So Jesus appeared to him and called him a valiant warrior. Look with me, if you will, in chapter 6, verse 12. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior." Now, I don't know about you, but the times when God calls me to do things, I feel the least like a valiant warrior that I could possibly feel. There are many times when I am so frightened and I think, me? Are you talking to me? Surely not. Surely you don't think I can do this. I remember when I was called to be the teaching leader of a very large international Bible study, and I felt so unworthy and so unqualified, and I was so shocked when I was asked to be this. Probably not as shocked as the leadership was when they heard that I was going to be the one, because they were really shocked. But I have never been so scared. And I had a problem like a lot of women have. I would get real emotional. And I still can whip myself up into a really good cry with very little trouble. But I was concerned about that, and God took that away miraculously. Now, that doesn't mean that I still can't come up with a real good cry every now and then, but I don't cry all the time like I did then. And I'm very grateful for that, because I had prayed and asked him for years to remove that, and he did. And I'm so thankful. You know, he knows who we are, but he also knows what we can become, and that's with his power. So he's not really looking for our ability. He's looking for our availability in order that he might fill us and use us powerfully. Now, Gideon brought out his list of excuses. He said, well, I'm the least in my tribe, and I'm the youngest. And he just went on and on like he was telling God something he didn't know. And he was saying, if you find this out, it'll probably disqualify me. Don't we do that? How many lists do you drag out to show God when he asks you to do something? You say, well, I'm too young. I don't say that. I'm too old. Or I'm too busy. Do we ever say that? I'm too inadequate. I'm too unspiritual. I'm too unqualified. Whatever it is, we say we don't have time and we can't do it. So, you know, we need to understand that when God calls us, he knows what we're doing, and we're not surprised. He knows what he's doing, and we're not surprising him in any way with our little list that we have. So we need to remember that. Gideon had doubts. Of course he did. He had doubts, don't we? We bring them to God, and God did answer his doubts. Remember, that's the story of the fleece, when he said, if you'd make it wet one time and dry another time. That's another wonderful story, and God did that for him. But when we bring out our list, we're saying that God is not able to do what he's asked us to do, and he's fully able to do that. What you want is a teachable spirit and a willingness to do it, and that's what happened here. And you know, Gideon was used in a mighty way. God took him on a miraculous journey. He had him gather an army of 36,000 men, and he whittled them down to 300. And you remember how they surrounded the enemy with torches and shouts and trumpets, and they routed that enemy, and they had the victory. I wish I could say that Gideon ended really well, but he didn't. He got a little prideful, and he decided that he was doing pretty good. You know, that happens to us sometimes. When we have victory in our life, we think we're doing great, and we give ourselves the credit for it. And we don't need God anymore. So Gideon sort of went out on his own. Even so, though, God let the land be restful and peaceful for another 40 years, which was a wonderful thing to see. Sometimes we move away from God, don't we, when we've had a victory in our life. It's a warning for us to stay close to him and to continue to serve him all the days of our life, not just when we have these great victories and then move out on our own. I heard a story about a person who was in a car, to a couple that was in a car, and she said to her husband, he's driving along, and she says to him, you know, honey, we just aren't as close as we used to be. We used to sit really close in the car. I just sat so close to you, and we were just all scrunched up together and so romantic, and we don't do that anymore. And as only a man could say this, he drives and says, well, I haven't moved. So that's a good lesson for us. God is not the one who moves. It's us. We're the ones who move. And then we see in chapter 13 through 16, we move over to Samson. Now, you probably remember Samson as the strong guy. One thing that Israel never seemed to learn from history is that you don't learn from history. And so Israel didn't learn, and neither do we. There was rebellion, and there was oppression, and all the repeat again. And then God sent a judge. Now, Israel cried out for a deliverer after this 40 years of oppression by the Philistines this time. We find that in chapter 13, verse 1. So after Gideon, there were 6 judges before Samson came on the scene, and Samson's probably the most memorable. But Samson was a whole lot like John the Baptist in that he was dedicated from birth. He was the son of parents who were barren and wanted a child so bad. And an angel came and proclaimed his birth. And so he was raised and instructed by godly parents. They did everything I'm sure they could possibly do, and it was really a wonderful thing. He was blessed with great strength, but he misused his strength. He misused his blessings. He was physically very strong, but spiritually very weak. He had a weakness toward women. He was forever getting himself in trouble with women. They would betray him, and he would do it all over again. And so we find Samson lost his strength, and he was unable to perform what God had asked him to do because he made wrong choices. They were his choices, not God's choices. He used his God-given strength for ungodly things. He went outside the boundary of what God said he could do, and he got himself in trouble. And then he met a woman called Delilah, and she was his undoing. And Delilah found out the secret to his strength, and she used it against him, and he was captured. His eyes were gouged out. He was made sport of by the enemy. But it has a wonderful ending to that story because even though this happened, God used him in a mighty way. God used Samson at the very end because Samson cried out to God and said, "Give me my one last desire, Lord. Let me bring these people down." And so, unbeknownst to them, his strength was coming back, and he was able to pull down the building that they were inside of, and all of them died. What this says that's so marvelous, I believe, is that God is always willing to forgive, and that it's never too late. As long as we have life, it's never too late. And we can cry out. You may be thinking today, "Oh, God will never forgive me for the things that I've done. I've just done so much you don't have a clue." But the truth is, He will. He always is listening for our cry. And so when we cry out to Him, He is a forgiving God. There's no end to His forgiveness. If you have failed Him in some way, you need to admit it and then get up and get busy, because He may have someone for you to encourage with your failure, and possibly even your own children. We need to admit this to our own children sometimes. You know, we need to just ask Him. There's stumbling blocks in our life like Samson had. We need to be aware of that and stay away from it. And then the third division that we're looking at today is the consequences of failure, and that's in chapter 17 through 21. This is a hard read, ladies. It really is. This is a sad time. This is when there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Wicked behavior shows the depravity of mankind without God. But it's about people who decided to take matters in their own hands and do what was right in their own eyes. Now, it sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? A lot like picking up today's newspaper or looking at the television. Now, I want to close with a principle that is so true because we have such a responsibility as women, and that is that godliness of the previous generation does not guarantee godliness of the present one. So we, as wives and mothers with a great deal of influence, need to get busy doing whatever we need to do to see that we don't forget who God is and what He's done.